Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Andy Rich, and I'm the Dean of the Colin Powell School here at City College, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to the 2024 Stanley Feingold Lecture on American Politics. Today, 20 years of rage, from anti-globalization to Trumpism. It is a privilege for us to have our very own faculty member, Carlo Invernizzi-Accetti, as our speaker. This is a difficult time in the politics of this country. We are less than a week out from national elections that divided the electorate. For some, the sweeping victory by Donald Trump and the Republicans is surprising. For many, it is deeply troubling. What does it represent with respect to the political views of the American people, their grievances, and their expectations for change? And what will it mean for our future as a nation and for the people of this nation, especially the most vulnerable and marginalized among us? We could not have predicted the precise outcomes of the elections when we planned this event several months ago, but we did know something about the politics of this nation, and we knew this would be a moment for reflection, to consider this election against currents that have been building in our politics and our society for decades, and that it would be a good moment to consider what's happening in the United States as part of global trends, movements for change. These are the matters that our speaker will consider today, and I'll introduce Carlo in just a moment. First, I want to share just a little bit of background on this very special series. This annual lecture is made possible by a group of City College alums, some of whom are with us today, some of whom are joining us on the live stream, who care deeply about the future of American politics. Their passion for politics is rooted in the one thing that I know they have in common, which is that all of them had Stanley Feingold as a professor. Professor Feingold, as I have learned in my years as dean, was a beloved and a gifted professor of political science who taught at City College for almost 4 decades. He wrote about American politics, he taught about American politics, and he ignited a passion among his students over many generations to be active in the political process, to wonder about our political system and to be forces for good in it. This annual event stems from that passion. In recent years, we have had Hakeem Jeffries, the House Democratic leader, Undivided Government, Gara LaMarche, the former head of the Open Society Foundation's U.S. programs and the Democracy Alliance on free speech, House members Karen Bass and Jamie Raskin on constitutional rights and protections. It's a highlight of the fall semester here at City College. And as we begin, I want to thank all of the Feingold alums who have made this series such an important part of the traditions at City College. And let me invite all of them to stand to be recognized. Thank you. Thank you for what you do. Thank you for being here. And again, I know that there are many online who are also watching, and we thank all of you well. I want to especially thank for their help on this year's event, Paul Bergman and Anita Altman, who have just worked so closely with us to make this afternoon a success. And I also want to acknowledge Fumiko Feingold, Professor Feingold's widow, who is with us today, Karen Feingold, his daughter, as well as Rich Deming, Karen's fiance. It is a privilege for us to be in relationship with a family and for us to remember what Mr. Feingold did for all of us here at City College. I want to turn it over to Anita Altman, a 1967 graduate of City College, a former student of Stanley Feingold, and Anita is going to share greetings from all of the Feingold alums.
Good afternoon. This is really, I think we feel very grateful to the school for enabling us to do this each year. So I thought, and we think, you should know a little bit more about Stanley. As you just heard, the series was founded by a large group of alumni in partnership with the Colin Powell School to honor the memory of Stanley Feingold, a beloved, gifted professor of political science. Stanley was a proud graduate of this college, and he taught here for almost 4 decades. He was a passionate teacher. He was devoted to intellectually challenging his students. He challenged everyone's view, whatever their politics, so that students would learn that we should take nothing for granted and that it was necessary to analyze carefully all facts and opinions to which we were exposed. In these times, this is a lesson that we need now more than ever, as we see the profound destructive impact that social media and its algorithms has fostered on our body politic. The reality is that Stanley didn't teach. Rather, he helped each student to develop his or her own ability to learn. Thousands, literally thousands of students benefited from his teaching, and as so many of us can testify, he did make us intellectually hungry, challenged our assumptions, and taught us analytic rigor and careful reasoning. He was to his students more than a teacher. He was a mentor, inspiring us to live a life with integrity and intellectual honesty, and for so many of us to pursue lives of public service. After he left the college, students of Stanley had the opportunity and good fortune to build a close personal relationship with him. They were able to meet with him periodically for brown bag lunches, which were devoted to heated discussions on the issues of the day, some on a regular basis for over 35 years. For almost 2 decades, Stanley flew in from the West Coast where he had retired to attend them. It was only then, at those lunchtime discussions, that we learned his real political opinions, passionately felt. But for all those years in the classroom, he carefully restrained from sharing them. Moreover, he continued to write, and we were blessed to receive his many opinion pieces. Over time, he wrote a significant body of essays which revealed his humanist, progressive perspective that challenged many conventional wisdoms. A link to Stanley's writings will be sent to you in a communication following this event in the hope that they will be more widely read, shared, and discussed. Finally, on behalf of my fellow alums, I want to express our profound appreciation for the most enthusiastic support of President Boudreaux, of Didi Mozaleski, the Senior VP for Institutional Advancement, and most especially to Dean Andy Rich and his staff, who have made it possible for us to honor our beloved teacher with the founding of this annual Stanley Feingold Lecture Series. Sorry, this is where I get a little emotional. My only regret is that Stanley is not here to receive this honor, for which he would have felt both humbled and very grateful to this institution that he so dearly loved. I know, too, that we and his family are delighted that we're able to celebrate this man, who, for so many of us, we were able, with great fortune, to call our teacher and friend. Thank you.
Anita, thank you very much. And I have to say, it's been a personal privilege for me over 5.5 years now as dean to get to know the Feingold alums, and in the course of that, to get to know Mr. Feingold himself and to realize the impact that faculty can have. And I know that many of the students in this room are in their first semester at City College, and you know, I think I've encouraged this in prior years, but it feels really apt today to encourage you to go find your Professor Feingold on this campus. We're still here, and he's inspired many of us in his example, and I hope you will. It is now my pleasure to introduce Carlo Invernizzi-Accetti. Carlo is Professor of Political Science here at CCNY. His research is at the point of intersection of democratic theory and comparative party politics, with a particular focus on Europe and the United States. He's published a number of books, including Technopopulism, The New Logic of Democratic Politics with Oxford University Press. He is a regular commentator on political affairs for everything from the New York Times and the Financial Times to The Guardian and La Repubblica. Carlo has another important title here at City College, and in this other title actually is indeed one of the people who emulates, I think, what Professor Feingold brought to this campus. He is the executive director of our new Moynihan Center. About 3 years ago, Carlo came to me with an idea, the possibilities for creating a new center at City College honoring the late Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who's an alum of CCNY, and the center would support new voices and new leaders who could help to bridge the political divide. It has been a particular personal pleasure to work closely with Carlo on that project over the past 3 years, and alongside all of his scholarly work, Carlo is now the executive director of the Moynihan Center, which formally launched just last year. It is a center that is supporting our students and mid-career scholars and public service leaders, and we are fortunate in every sense to have Carlo's leadership on this initiative and many others, something that has such a direct alignment with today's talk and with this series. Carlo is going to share remarks for about 20-25 minutes, and then he will be joined by a discussant and moderator, Amina Fontanella Khan. Amina is the opinion editor of The Guardian in the United States. She was formerly a contributing editor at Vogue India. She's a contributor for the New York Times, the Financial Times Weekend Magazine, Slate, Christian Science Monitor, and more. Amina will ask a few questions of her own, and then we're going to open it up to audience questions. There's going to be a microphone in the front of the auditorium, and if you have a question when we get to that, please go ahead and come on up and form a line, and Amina will call on you. And with that, Carlo, Amina, and Nita, and all of you, my thanks, and let me turn it over to Carlo.
Hello, everybody. Welcome, and thank you for being here. It's an honor and a pleasure to give this lecture in the spirit of Professor Feingold. What I will be presenting is the main argument from a book that I recently published in Italy, in Italian, of the title of the same as this talk. And I'm currently in the process of translating and adapting to the US context, not least in light of the results of last week's election. So I very much look forward to sharing my ideas with you for that reason, and especially to your feedback and your questions, again, in the spirit of Professor Feingold. The topic of the book, the book is an attempt to understand what the German philosopher Hegel would call the Zeitgeist, or the spirit of our times. Or perhaps less ambitiously, to give a name to these turbulent years that we have been living since, let's say, more or less the beginning of the century, or the turn of the millennium. These have been turbulent times, for sure, and we have all lived through them. So for many of people in this room, maybe most of their lives have been these past 20, 25 years. So I don't think it's necessary for me to start by recounting everything that happened, but what I will do is start by giving a sense of some of the most salient events of these 2 decades that are the main object of my analysis, and then also, even before that, comparing them to how life felt in that period a little bit before, for contrast, because it was not always thus. So in preparing for this lecture, I actually had the opportunity of looking over again on YouTube the inaugural speech that President Bill Clinton gave upon taking office in 1992, which really is a document from another time. Because as you may remember, at that time, it was the end of the fall of the Berlin Wall, the end of the Cold War, and the spirit that exudes, if you have a chance of looking at that speech, from the speech is, yep, we did it, we won, it's over, now it's just a matter of promoting the model of America across the world, a model based on capitalism and democracy and the promise of globalization. So it was a very optimistic and self-confident time that has been described by some, like American political scientist Francis Fukuyama, the end of history. It felt like a good moment that we were optimistic about. Since about 2000, things have started changing. And here I'll just give you a list of some of the things that happened that may help us get a sense of what I'm going to be talking about in these 20 minutes. It started to change with the so-called Seattle protests at the end of the century, the anti-globalization movement of the early 2000s. And then, of course, the terrible September 11th attacks of 2001 that sparked the so-called war on terror that maybe hasn't even ended yet. And then, again, more of these events continued happening over the course of these 2 decades. I'm just giving a list to give a sense of perspective. In 2003, there were in 2005, the so-called riots in the French banlieues around Paris. And soon after, the no to the proposed European constitutional referendum. Then 2008 to 2011, the Great Recession sparked a number of protest movements across the world. The Indignados movement in Spain, Occupy Wall Street in the United States, the no to the proposed memorandum of reforms to Greece, the OCHI in the referendum. And then again, this 2 decades keeps accelerating. 2016 has been described as the annus horribilis because of first the vote for Brexit and then the first election of Donald Trump as president, which also sparked a number of protest movements in this country especially. Me Too, Black Lives Matter, the so-called Fridays for Future led by Greta Thunberg. In France, the Gilets jaunes. But it doesn't end. It just keeps accelerating more and more until up to very recently, of course, the campus protests over the events in Israel and Gaza, and up to the election of last Tuesday. So the question of my book is, of course, all of these events have a particular history and their own specificities, but is there a common thread? Is there something running through these 2 decades that can help us define a spirit of the times, a zeitgeist? And the argument I make is that if there is such a zeitgeist, it's not at the level of actors or at the level of goals. All of the actors that were involved in these activities were different from each other, and their goals were very different from one another too. But it's at the emotional level. It's at the level of the mood of the times that it's different from the end of history. And I guess the argument of the book is that if there is such a mood today, it's a mood of anger or rage against political institutions. And in this sense, these can be described as 20 or 25 years of rage, or as the raging 20. And to convince you of that, in the remaining, I guess now 15 minutes, what I want to do is briefly talk a little bit, following the structure of the book, first of what is rage, and why do I think it's an adequate emotion to capture the spirit of our times. Then I'll talk a little bit about why I think so many people, so many different people have been so angry at political institutions over these 2 decades. And then I'll end talking a little bit about the responses that have been given by our political systems to this rage, and why I think that instead of mitigating it, they've actually contributed in further exacerbating it. All right, so what is rage? To answer this question, in my book, I turn to what I know best, which is also what I teach here at City College, which is the history of Western political philosophy. And the first thing you can learn if you look at the archive of Western political philosophy about rage is that rage does not have a good reputation in the history of Western political philosophy. If you take the classic text on this, the Roman Stoic philosopher Seneca De Ira on anger, rage is described as a brevis insania, a temporary madness, of course, therefore, as a pathology. And this is part of the broader Stoic condemnation of all emotions in the context of the classic Western rationalist opposition between reason, good, male, emotions, bad, female. And so that's part of our tradition, of course. But it's not just the Stoic rationalist tradition of the West that condemns rage. Even if you take the Christian tradition, of course, anger is one of the cardinal sins, and the invitation of Jesus is to turn the other cheek. And this perpetual condemnation of rage continues even into early modernity. If you take early bourgeois morality, there was that opposition between the passions and the interests. And the idea was that rage, if you read, for instance, Montesquieu, is associated with war, and therefore bad, whereas interest, rational pursuit of one's own interests, is associated with trade, and therefore good, le doux commerce. And even in today's therapeutic culture, rage is seen as something fundamentally pathological. You may know that your employers or the court systems can prescribe courses in anger management, showing that anger is something that needs to be repressed and controlled. So the pattern is clear. Rage is pathological, irrational, bad. And I think this is a problem if we want to understand the present time, because if we start from a concept that already judges its object in that way, I think here we can see many of the echoes of how all of these movements I talked about have often been dismissed and belittled by the existing establishment, by being described as manifestations of an irrational rage. And I think that's not a very good way to understand the present, because the irrational cannot, by definition, be understood. For that reason, in the book, I turn to an earlier, pre-Stoic, pre-Christian tradition for trying to understand what rage actually is. I turn to the ancient Greeks, in the context of which it seems to me rage is not seen as something pathological, but if you read ancient Greek texts, as something natural, and therefore in that sense healthy, and maybe even noble. Maybe you might know that the first word of Homer's Iliad, which is to say, therefore, the first word of Western literature, is rage, menin. It is the rage of Achilles that drives the whole drama of the Iliad. Achilles is angry and refuses to fight with his peers against the Trojans, and it's a poem about Achilles' rage. And in that context, it's clearly not pathological. It is, in fact, the mark of a hero. It's important to be able to feel rage, and that is a virtue of Achilles, the hero. So much so that in a commentary on this that he gives in the Rhetoric, Aristotle even goes as far as to say that the incapacity to feel rage is the mark of a slave. If you're not able to get angry when you see an injustice, then you're not worthy of being, in Aristotle's case, a democratic citizen. Citizens need to be able to get angry in the face of injustice. And so there's nothing pathological with that. That's why I want to go back to this tradition to try to understand from a non-pathologizing perspective the present time. So why is Achilles angry? And I think there is an important key to understand the present time. If you remember the story, Achilles is angry because Agamemnon, the king of the Greeks, has taken his slave, Briseis, that he had conquered in battle. But what's important to understand about this is that Achilles is not angry because this theft has made him poorer. In fact, Agamemnon tells him you can have any slave you want, even more slaves. Achilles is angry because he said, I have been treated like any foreigner. I have been treated like any foreigner. And I think here there is an interesting key to understanding the present day. What makes Achilles angry is a sense of being slighted, a sense of offense to his status, to his dignity. The great hero has been treated like any foreigner. So it's an offense to his dignity, to his status, to his sense of worth. The common theme behind all of these things is that it points to a dimension of recognition. People get angry when they don't feel recognized by others in the level of dignity or status that they believe to have. And here I think there is a key for understanding the present day anger, because if we turn to many of the slogans that have marked these turbulent 20 years of rage, America first, make America great again, Allah is great, Black Lives Matter, Me Too, or the yellow vests of those who were protesting in France, which are there to be seen, is what you use to be seen. None of these slogans actually point, it seems to me, to some economic, socioeconomic demands. They all point to this dimension of recognition of one's own status. They point to the dimension of people want to be treated how they believe their dignity. People want to be treated with dignity. Black Lives Matter. And in that sense, rage stems from an affront to somebody's dignity, and this is at the heart. A lot of people in our present day feel invisible, unseen, undignified, and that's why they're angry. Even more so, I dare say, than because of some socioeconomic types of revendications. That's rage. That's how Aristotle and Achilles teach us to think about rage. So if that's the case, why are so many people angry? Why do so many people feel invisible to the point of wearing yellow vests to be seen, to be saying, me too? Here, I'm moving to the second part of my talk. I drew inspiration from another philosopher in our tradition, again, Hegel, who has a point in the phenomenology of spirit that is at the core of my argument. And his point is that recognition, the way you are seen by others, is not something that can be given to you by the state or by one citizen to another. Recognition is something that can only be obtained in the first person through a struggle. And that is this famous struggle for recognition that Hegel talks about in the philosophy of right. Or in the phenomenology of spirit, excuse me, and in the philosophy of right. But so there's this idea that struggle, political struggle in particular, is not only good for the material goods that you can get through the struggle. There is a dignity in the struggle that happens because through the struggle you're transformed as a subject and become the kind of subject that is worthy of recognition. So the struggle itself, the participation in politics, is what makes you become worthy of the recognition and makes you feel recognized by the struggle independently of whatever you gain through the struggle. If that's the case, one thing we can note about the past few decades is that this idea of struggle as a constitutive part of citizenship has been declining for decades. There's been a dissolution of the dimension of political struggle. There's a famous book by Houellebecq, The Contraction of the Domain of the Struggle. And to analyze it a bit further, we can see that struggle has something like two components: active participation and organized conflict. And Hegel thinks both are required. You have to participate, and you have to participate in conflict in order to feel dignified, in order to obtain recognition of your status. And both these dimensions, an enormous social science literature shows, have been declining for decades. I refer, for instance, to the famous book of Robert Putnam, Bowling Alone, from the year 2000, which shows that over the past 2 decades, participation in civic associations in America, participation in political parties, all measures of participation have been declining. So we have the first dimension of struggle is participation, and we've had less of that. And the second, organized struggle. We've had a lot of struggle, but this struggle feels a little different. Because it's not organized in the way in which traditional political struggle was organized in the 20th century, around the classic divisions, if you will, of class, of religion, of region. What we have seen is that all these traditional social groups, I'm thinking in particular about class, have been declining in favor of more individualized, atomized society of self-referential individuals, whereby the struggle is not actually a struggle between groups, but it's more like the Hobbesian struggle of everyone against everybody else. We are all struggling a lot in our lives today, but we're not struggling as parts of groups in organized conflict. We're struggling with each other in a war of all against all. And ultimately, I guess my thesis is that it is precisely that individualization, that solitude, that retreat into the private of our present society, which drives the sense of lack of recognition that we all feel, and therefore the anger that has been manifested in so many different ways. Before I move to the third and last part of the lecture, I cannot resist summarizing this through, this book is not an academic book, it's more intended to be a trade book. So the key intuition of why we're so angry, I refer to a famous film that I'm not sure how many of you have seen anymore in this room, but have you seen Taxi Driver by Scorsese? That film, I think, captures the key intuition that I'm trying to advance. What is the story of Taxi Driver? It's a story of Travis Bickle, a veteran from Vietnam who comes back from the war to discover a society that has pulverized, disintegrated. He tries to join a political party, but he sees it's all empty, it's all fake, it's all performative. He has difficulty making friends. He has difficulty joining any collective project. Even a woman refuses him, and so he's, in that sense, an incel. And falls back more and more into his taxi, driving around behind this screen into the streets of New York, nurturing a resentment against society. And ultimately, that resentment ends up in his great revenge against society, which is the really violent last scene where he commits a massacre and ends up killing a pimp. That is it. We are all Travis Bickle today. We are all individualized behind our screens, alienated from the struggle, alienated from each other, and in that sense, increasingly angry at society against which we periodically take our revenges, like Travis Bickle. Okay, So I told you what I think anger is. I told you why I think we're angry. Now the last part of the lecture is going to be about what the political systems have done to address this and why I think it has exacerbated rather than mitigated the problem. And it seems to me there have been two fundamental answers that politics has given to this seething sense of rage against it over the past 2 decades. The organizing poles of contemporary politics are technocracy on one side and populism on the other. We live in a world of populism and technocracy rather than organized political parties nowadays. So let's talk about why I think both of these things fail. Technocracy is the idea that you can answer the seething rage of today with what they call good government or good governance. The idea that if only we put competent people in charge, they will give the people goodies, and then the people will be happy and relax and stop protesting. I think this hypothesis fundamentally misunderstands the cause of rage. Because if the argument I have proposed is right, that the root of rage has to do with recognition rather than, I dare say, redistribution, then just giving people more goodies won't cut it. People will remain angry. And that, I think, a good example of that is what I take to be the unfortunate failure of Bidenism and Bidenomics to address the seething rage in our country. In fact, it seems to me Biden and Bidenomics did pretty much all the things that us progressives said that the state should do to address Trumpism after 2016. Redistribution, massive industrial investment, especially in the most downtrodden areas, the Inflation Recovery Act, the stimulus, the infrastructure bill. There's been a lot of spending in the most disadvantaged parts of our economy, and the economy is doing fine. There's virtually full employment. Wages in the lower quintile have risen more, not only than inflation, but those in the higher quintiles, meaning there's been a decrease in inequality over the last 4 years. And yet Tuesday. So that doesn't work, because this idea that giving goodies from above is somehow going to resolve the people's rage doesn't quite get to the root of the problem, which is this desire for struggle, desire for participation, desire for recognition that is at the heart of contemporary rage. Populism, on the other hand, it seems to me, understands the root of the rage, understands very well why people are so angry and can relate to that. America First answers the sense of having been put second, the sense of having been declassed, of one's status having been brought down. And all of the other slogans too, but the most famous is one from not the most famous, but the most effective for me in this context is one from a political party in Italy, where I come from, the 5-Star Movement, whose slogan was "Uno vale uno," everyone is worth one. I think that Beppe Grillo understood that that's the root. People want to matter. And populism promises to answer that desire for dignity that is at the heart of contemporary rage. But in my opinion, ultimately, so even though they diagnose the proper problem correctly, the answer that populism gives is, in my opinion, inadequate and ultimately counterproductive too. Because what populism is and what populism does is the attempt to transfer this desire for struggle and participation from the people who feel it to this figure of a charismatic leader that fights on your behalf. What does Trump say? Fight, fight, fight. So there's some kind of giving over of your struggle. Trump's struggle is all of our struggles. And in that sense, people feel hope that he's going to give answers to our feeling of lack of recognition, but ultimately it doesn't work, because you cannot struggle on behalf of somebody else. If the whole point is a struggle requires active participation, populism actually supposes a rather passive electorate that gives over their powers to the leader, the charismatic leader that fights on their behalf. And therefore ultimately ends up summoning the rage, identifying it, but is incapable of channeling it and giving it a political resolution. In my country, we've seen this very clearly with the whole sort of roller coaster of different populisms that we've had with Berlusconi, with Grillo, with the League of the North. And I think something similar may unfortunately happen in the United States too, with this circus of populists who are always going to try to summon the rage, but are ultimately incapable of answering it, because they want to take it upon themselves to fight, rather than allowing for an organized struggle from below. So neither populism nor technocracy works. I don't have an answer of how we solve this problem of the secular decline of political struggle. But one thing I know is unless we get out of this binary between populism and technocracy, if you're really angry, get organized, and that's going to be the way out of it. Thank you very much. Fontanella Cane is going to join me on stage, and we're going to have a conversation now. As I said, I really look forward to your questions, and thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Carlo. That was a really interesting talk. I must say, is it Years of Rage? I think that's really catchy. I can't wait to, the raging 20s. Yeah, can't wait to tell my kids about, my years in the raging 20s. So you had this amazing quote, I'm paraphrasing, but it was, if you don't feel rage, then you're a slave. Who was it that said that?
Aristotle.
Aristotle. So is rage good?
I believe with Achilles and with Aristotle that rage is the beginning of politicization. Rage is the beginning of how you become interested in politics, but I also believe that it's not enough. It's the start. Hannah Arendt, another political theorist I love a lot, drew a distinction between liberation and freedom. There's a distinction between the struggle for liberation, removing some form of oppression, and then constituting freedom. I think rage is good for liberation. It's a good way to get out of an oppressive condition, but it's really bad at then constituting a political order where we can actually have freedom. So there needs to be some political way of channeling this rage into something more productive. If you notice, all of these movements from the past, anti-globalization, I forgot to mention the no-vax in 2020, have all been based on no. Rage is a big no. And it's good to say no to injustice, but then there's the question of what are you going to say yes to, and that I don't think rage is good at answering.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting. You in your talk, you really like foregrounding recognition. More so than economic conditions. You're saying that this is kind of really sort of animating the rage that we're seeing. You're saying the economy is fine. I'd probably want to push back a little bit. I think that for many. Many people are struggling. I think Piketty has described that we're living in sort of a new gilded era. What is your definition when you say that we're doing materially well? Like, how do you define that? And what would you say to people that are who would challenge that and say, actually, no, we're really not doing fine, and economically people are actually struggling, despite the fact that maybe compared to like other historical periods are relatively better, but obviously if you were born today, you're not comparing yourself to someone who lived 100 years ago. So what's your answer to?
Yes, thank you. Look, let me say two things in response to that. The first is that I do not mean to deny the importance of socioeconomic factors in determining political outcomes. What I want to do is emphasize other factors that may be at play too. So you can have problems of redistribution and problems of recognition at the same time. The fact is that we've been focusing a lot, and this is what was motivating me. Why did Bidenism fail? Why did Bidenomics not work? It seems to me that it's because they were not considering this other dimension. So without denying the importance of that. But what I would say to somebody who challenges that the economy is doing well is the kind of data that I put forward, which is that, full employment. This is not the 19th. People say it's in the 1930s. No, in Germany in 1930 you had 40% unemployment, and then you get Hitler. Today you have full employment. You also have we did have cumulative inflation over the past 4 years, around 20-25%, but real wages exceeded that, especially in the lower quintile, which means that actually I don't see this explanation as being sufficient for explaining why people are still angry. There's been massive stimulus, massive investment. We ended austerity. We did what the progressives wanted us to do in 2016, but yet we're still here. So that's the conundrum I'm trying to explain without denying the importance of socioeconomic factors.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting also just, looking at recognition and the desire for political participation. I wanted to sort of get you to speak to the relationship between political struggle and recognition and economic and material well-being, because the two clearly go hand in hand, right? Like, it was thanks to unions and protests and mobilization that we got minimum wage, that we got the end of segregation, Jim Crow, that we got just a huge increase in our standard of living. So the two clearly are related.
Right, so this goes, agreed. I think the mistake would be to separate economics from the symbolic dimension of recognition. So while I want to emphasize the importance of the latter, I don't want to deny the importance of the former, and I think the example you point to really makes that point well. Struggle produces both. If you are organized and you organize well, you can get material benefits from it, but in my opinion, you can also get something more and maybe more worthwhile than a bit more wealth, which is a sense of dignity, a sense that you matter as a citizen, and that being part of politics is what makes you worthy of being part of politics. And so there's that kind of virtuous cycle whereby participation and organization and struggle produces both material wealth in some regards, but also just that sense of the dignity of the struggle.
Can you speak a little bit to what, like, how you picture, like, what this dignity, like what it feels like, what it actually looks like to someone who's involved in political struggle?
Right, I'll give you an example from my country, which I know better, but I'm learning about America. So if you took a worker in a factory in the 1970s in Italy, let's say he worked for Fiat, which is now Chrysler, he was compared to a no-vaxxer of today, I think immeasurably, absolutely poor. The number of calories he ate, the number of trips abroad he took, like whatever absolute measure of wealth that you had in the 1970s, a worker in the 70s was poorer than a worker today. But I don't think that worker was that angry. I don't think they felt so invisible and disaffected. Why? Because if he was in Italy, he probably had a card of the Italian Communist Party. He probably participated in a church that went there every Sunday. He was part of an organized struggle, that struggle over class, over religion, over region, that are the types of struggle that are lost today. And that's why the no-vaxxer is richer today, but alienated from society, alienated from politics, and for that reason, angrier.
But that worker in the 70s, saw the post-war boom, right? Like, just saw his life just getting better and better and better. So wouldn't that also...
No, I would say,
right.
He was better off than in the 40s, but he's much worse than today. So why is it that people who are much better off today are still angry, or more angry than they were in the 70s? That's the question I'm trying to answer. We've seen comparable levels of growth from the 70s to the 40s, and today relative to the 70s. People are just iPhones, flights. Like, it's a different society. It's a much more consumer wealthy society.
Yeah, no, it's interesting when you were just sort of describing the isolationism, the isolation that people face, and the atomization, right, of our current era, like, is linked to technology and the internet and iPhones, etc. Can you speak a little bit more to that? Because obviously, it's also allowed people on Twitter to suddenly have, like, huge, just random people that never before would have mass audiences can reach millions of people, right? And so, which they could never have done in previous media eras, where you were just had like this one-way direction of information. You're just passively, like, watching TV or passively listening to the radio, and now you can just get on your phone and tweet something, and potentially, the president of the United States might read it or retweet it because he does that kind of thing. So where does that kind of fit into this analysis?
Right. This may be an unpopular opinion in this context, but I'm maybe a little bit old-fashioned, and I think that hacktivism or click revolution is not quite like organized struggle. That's why I like the metaphor of Travis Bickle behind his screen, which is in his case a taxi screen, but we're all behind our screens today. So a South Korean political philosopher called Hung Chung-Bao talks about the difference between organized classes in the 70s and what we have today, which are swarms, where there is kind of collective action online where everybody tweets, but it's also fundamentally different because you remain isolated from everybody else. The participation is, first of all, much less costly. It's much easier to click your way to revolution, and it's not as socializing. You're separated from everybody else, and you're doing it from the comfort of your home. And from that context, it's much easier to get alienated from others and to get angry at others. So for him, whereas the form of struggle of the 70s and of class was the strike, today, he says, the form of struggle of the swarm is the shitstorm online, where everybody starts tweeting, and that is supposed to have an effect. Maybe you feel a little better after having participated in a shitstorm online, but I don't think you get the same sense of community or dignity or recognition than you do from good old-fashioned participation with others.
Right. I mean, it seems to me that there's a challenge given that, you know, we've seen the rise of like working from home, the decline of like, you know, factory, like the sort of like the places that we used to have like unions sort of forming collective, you know, whatever action, mobilization of workers. Obviously, churches are in decline, and also, you know, people. Rent is very high, people are working many jobs, and so it is a luxury to find the time to actually like, mobilize too, right? And to meet people. So, I mean, are you sort of optimistic that that it's even going to be possible? Because it feels like we're just trending towards like more
I'm not
isolation.
that optimistic. I'm sorry, I'm not that optimistic. What I think is that there's a loneliness epidemic. There is the anxious generation, you guys, and like people that is affected by the phone and by this screen-mediated society. And yeah, you gotta get out there if you wanna meet people, and it's not the same to meet them online. So I'm not optimistic about how technology can help us. I think you can use technology in organizing. You can use technology for the struggle, but the struggle gotta be real. Mm-hmm. Otherwise, what you get is the shitstorm.
Right. But it's not enough to like, you know, be online, be, you know, sort of tweeting, and then you go to a rally or a protest. That there's like a third step that needs to follow, right? For it to not just be pure rage. And what can you speak to like what that third stage would be?
No, but I don't think it's a third stage. It's the first stage. The third stage of what you're saying, what after the shitstorm comes the flash mob, where we all go to some place for 10 minutes, we meet, and that's the protest. No, organized political struggle comes before the internet, in the sense that you gotta have a project, you gotta have a group, and you use the internet maybe to mobilize people.
But with who? If you're on your own, who do you turn to?
And that's it. And I don't have the answers. I'm not a prophet. I'm a political scientist. So all I can do is analyze the situation we are in and see why there are problems, why we're anxious, why we're lonely, why we're angry. But look, and so that's why I end in one sentence saying, look, you're angry, get organized. That's how you're going to solve it. You can't wait for either Trump or Biden to solve that for you. That would be as far as I'm willing to go in the prophecy.
Well, even though you're not a prophet, I think that there are many people in the audience who have questions for you, and I want you to try to answer, give some glimpse into the future. Yeah, so there's a mic up front. You guys could just feel free to form a line if that works.
Please, I encourage you, because I really care about what you have to tell me. So also the students, if you want to come, don't hesitate.
My name is Ron Goldbrenner. I graduated from City College in 1962, before a lot of your parents were born. And I'm a lawyer. And I think this may be, if not the best, one of the best lectures we ever had, because you've raised so many ideas that we have to think about. And rage, for example, I view it more as a heightening of passion. Sometimes the rage can be good when you're anti-Nazi. Sometimes the rage can be bad when you're pro-Nazi. So you have to look further into what's happening to say whether rage, what it is and whether it's good or bad. Now, in that connection, would you talk a little bit about how propaganda can influence rage, sometimes creating a false rage, sometimes creating something that's real. And particularly in this world of social media, where so much stuff comes over the transom, how do you filter it so you know what's good and right and just, and you should become enraged, and what is nonsense and you should discard?
Thank you. Should we maybe do all the questions, sure, and then you can, so that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Sure.
Hey, Carlo. There was so much in your talk, so I'm only going to pick one piece, the distinction between technocracy and populism. But I think you have to break populism up. In 2016, we had two populists. We had Donald Trump and we had Bernie Sanders. Very different. Bernie Sanders talked about the elites on Wall Street. Donald Trump talked about the elites letting in immigrants and so on and so forth. I want to break populism up because Donald Trump was a populist, but he was more of a demagogue. And and that's something you haven't addressed, because demagoguery is very different than populism. Bernie Sanders wasn't saying, I alone can solve it. He also wasn't, he was trying to channel the rage you're talking about into something productive. Whereas Trump's demagoguery would say the reason you're enraged is because of immigrants. The reason you're enraged is because the family has fallen apart, and so on and so forth. So I wanted you to address that distinction.
Should we take them all, or maybe a few?
Yeah,
because otherwise I'm
I
gonna
just
forget. Okay.
Oh, I'm writing them down, so
Okay.
I've got them all.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Hi. Yeah, so my question is kind of the same thing as the first one. So, like, why do you think it's so much easier for the right to kind of take advantage of rage compared to the left? Like, it's, you know, like, it's so much easier to be susceptible to, like, right-wing propaganda when you're enraged at something. Like, let's say you're a man, right? And you see, like, this kind of increase in women feeling more empowered and feeling more safe to be outside, and you're scared that, you know, maybe you're gonna be hit with like a false rape accusation, and that's something that you feel really enraged about because that's like a real fear of yours. But what if that rage, you know, escalates into something that's not as, I guess, realistic, and like that just makes you go down this path of like hating women, like having like misogynistic views. And so like my question is, like, what do you think the left has to do to be able to, like, take advantage of the rage in the same way that the right is able to?
Just take a few more.
Hi, I'm Marcus. I have a three-part question. It's, what made you choose to get into politics? It's more questions about you. What made you choose to get into politics? What makes you so passionate about these issues in the first place? And what made you want to learn about the issue of people not feeling dignified?
Thank you. I really would, if I could answer a few, because I'm going to forget, and there's so many.
Okay, sounds good. So I'll just remind everyone what the questions were. There was one about propaganda. There was one about populism versus demagoguery. Then there was one about why does the right wing tend to take advantage more than the left wing of rage? And then there was one about you personally.
So I'm going to take them in the reverse order. The last question, I appreciate your curiosity, but I'm not into politics. I'm actually into this, which is education. And what made me interested in this is actually how pessimistic I am about that, which is that I'm not sure that at the level of politics there is a solution to this rage. I'm hoping that you guys will take that over if you become a different kind of generation. So I'm not in politics, and I'm passionate about it because I care about our world like we all do, and I hope to be able to contribute to changing the future generations, given that ours has failed so poorly at ours. Which leads me to the question before about, I thought that was a great question about why the left has such a hard time dealing with these issues of recognition compared to the right. I'm not sure I'm going to take the part about what should the left do, because I told you I don't know what. If I knew that, I wouldn't be here. There's an interesting answer to me of why the left has a hard time with this, because there's an easy way you can give people recognition, and it's a right-wing way, and it's called identity politics. It's like if you reduce people to their identity and recognize them as the white working class or something like that, then they immediately feel recognized, but it divides us up into silos from each other as a society in ways that I think ultimately tends right. So all forms of identity, I agree with Marx, at least in this, the Marx on the Jewish question. All these forms of division among society that are basically forms of identity are actually regressive and right-wing, or tend towards the right, and right is winning at identity politics. Look, they said we are the majority identity, we're winning. So the problem of recognition lends itself to an easy right-wing answer. The trouble for the left would be to make people feel recognized, feel dignified, without falling back on the categories of identity, it seems to me. And that is something that was done before with these ideas of organized universal struggles based on other criteria. That seems to me to have existed at a certain time in the 20th century and to have very much declined today. So I don't know what will be the new universal struggles that will take the place of identity politics on the left. But that's my answer to why the right is doing so much better, because identity politics tends rightwards. The next question was about, is there a left populism? I know, as you, Bruce, know very well, and we talk about in our department all the time, these are all terms that are debated by political scientists like us a lot, and there are different definitions of populism, of demagoguery. So if you take my definition of populism, the one I was working with, I don't think Bernie Sanders was a populist. I think he was just a good old social democrat who totally recognized the legitimacy of opposition. So one important aspect of populism, as I see it, is because you are the leader who embodies the whole people, you cannot recognize that there might be others who disagree with you. So Trump says, I represent the true American people. Those of us who didn't vote for him, are we untrue people? There's no space for the legitimacy of opposition within populism. And in that sense, Bernie Sanders, in fact, proved an incredible degree of loyalty towards the Democratic Party, even when he disagreed with it, even just now, in a way that he was just a good old social democrat, advanced his own party line within the framework of the Democratic Party, and lost. And to recognize defeat is part of not being a populist. That's a big difference between Bernie and Trump too. When Trump lost, he said, I haven't lost. And when Bernie lost, every time he said, okay, I serve the cause. So I don't, in that sense of populism, as this idea of a charismatic leader that embodies the whole people, I don't think Sanders is a left populist. And I think left populism is a contradiction in terms. I think that social democracy might be a left-wing thing, but left and populism don't go together, because populism goes with authoritarian, homogenizing strategies a la Trump. So for me, the reading of 2016 was, yeah, Americans don't like social democracy very much, but they're okay with populism. And that's too bad. And the last question about propaganda, it's interesting to me. Yeah, so propaganda is an ambiguous concept, because if you want to do politics, if you want to get organized, I don't think propaganda is a bad word. Propaganda is to propagate your message. Propaganda is to advance it. And if you want to win, you better start doing some propaganda in the service of your cause. So the distinction you were asking about, how do we distinguish the good rage from the bad rage, is we should do some propaganda too, but we should do it for the values that we stand for. It just so happens that minus Barack Obama, it seems our communicators are not that good at propaganda compared to the ones on the other side. And I think we should do more, but better propaganda to counter the propaganda of the right.
You're right about propaganda being both good and bad. But what we are suffering from now is a surfeit of bad propaganda. And
Right.
it's much harder to counter bad propaganda with good propaganda, because the good story is rational, whereas the bad propaganda is designed to appeal to people's hatreds and emotions and all the rest. How do we...
Right. So I don't know if you've all had a chance to hear the question. Is the bad propaganda is based on lies, is a word I heard many times, or the good propaganda is rational? Again, whereas I think, emotionally in agreement with you, and I'm also sort of outraged by many of the lies that have been advanced by one of the two camps, I don't think that framing the political opposition in terms of we got the truth, we are rational, and they're emotional, and they lie, is going to bring us very far. I think that there's a conflict of values. We disagree about values, not about who has the truth. We both, like, I agree with Arendt in this too. Truth is not a very political category. Euclid was a great despot, Arendt said, because you can't found a politics of truth. Politics emerges when there is disagreement. And we have disagreement on values with the other side. I wouldn't claim that we have the truth, because automatically that's a populist position and a technocratic one for me, in the sense that you're discounting the opposition as immediately based on wrong things and lies. So the New York Times certainly agrees with you in the sense that from 2016 to 2020, they launched a whole truth campaign, and they were worried about post-truth. I see that as a losing game. I've never seen truth as a very powerful political category. You've got to appeal emotionally to a political project that is around values rather than truths. Because then you get what we have today, post-truth, and people disagree about facts. And it's really difficult to persuade others that ours are the right facts, because they think that theirs are the right facts. So for me, it's not about we have the truth and they have the lies. It's just we have different opinions, and let's struggle.
Okay, very good recall, Carlo, on those questions. I was just testing your memory there. We're going to take a few, we only have a few more minutes left, so we're just going to take a few, and then maybe, Carlo, you can try to touch on whatever that comes to.
I'm Asa. I'm in your political theory class. I guess I want to focus on more specifically, you mentioned like loneliness. You also mentioned like incels and how this is like rising the anger. And I guess my main question is, how do we combat that loneliness that we're feeling? And is it just specifically social media that's causing this division, or is it also like the institutions in place, politics? Like, what else is causing this division, and how can we address this loneliness epidemic that's happening in my generation? Thank you.
Hi, I'm Chloe. I'm also in your political theory class. I wanted to ask that I was really impacted by your statement that we need more than rage to go from liberation and constituting freedom. So my question is, how do you prevent rage turning into despair, especially in the results of the election? And how do we build that resilience to continue on to a goal that really kind of isn't defined? So that's my question.
Yep, thank you.
Hey, Carlo, great lecture. I'm from the Moynihan Center. My question was around participation in collectivized struggle and organized struggle. You mentioned it was a result of, the digital age and things like that. That was one of the causes. But I was wondering how much of a problem does like the militarization of police in countries, especially the US, and the rise of authoritarianism and policies play in kind of what's it called, dissuading people from like physically participating in protests and rallies, given that there's more of a threat to their existence now.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, my name is Thayer Grimes. I wanted to ask what you believed capitalism's role was in the individualization of struggle. Like, do you believe that it's like a collective struggle of the working class people against like, the elites of society? Or do you think it's like an individualized struggle between each other?
Great.
Hello, my name's Abdul. I'm too tall for this. So earlier in your monologue, you mentioned a worker in Italy who would be working in a factory, and you said how his life is much worse than a person's life today. But what we have seen over the last few generations, I would argue that society has digressed, as in the term that the difference between the 1%ers and the middle class is so large that it's hard to comprehend how big the difference is. Why is it that when these workers are showing rage by voting one party or the other, we are arguing which party is right? Why don't we see it as an effect of a long-standing institution being changed?
Thank you.
Hello, my name's Oscar, and my question was just, why do you think that this rage, specifically on the right, seems to fuel conspiracy theories online, like aliens, and why do you think it's so much more prevalent that this like basic distrust of the government in like all aspects, that they're hiding secrets from us as the American people? Why do you think that that rage lends itself so perfectly to those ideas?
Great.
Hi, Carlo. My question is, you said you don't have a solution, but for people who are angry and feel rage to get together, organize, and find a way to be recognized and distinguished. When people have done that in the past for the BLM movement, they have been called rioters and looters, and for the Palestinian movement, they've been called terrorist and anti-Semitic. How do we face collective efforts without being demonized from every level of authority, as we've seen in recent history?
Okay, those are lots of very good questions. We only have a few more minutes. Is there some way you can just somehow...
Yeah, like how do we solve capitalism, for collective action?
Loneliness.
Loneliness.
Conspiracy theories.
Conspiracy theories. And how many minutes?
And we need to prevent rage from leading to despair also, please.
Right. In how many minutes?
So I think we only really have 3-4 minutes, so...
Okay. All right.
Give us your best shot.
Where to start? But, okay, let's just reiterate a point I've been trying to make. I think the way out of rage cannot be that somebody comes in and saves you, right? It's through struggle that you come out of rage, because the dignity is in the struggle. So waiting for politicians to solve our problems ain't gonna cut it. That's the first point. So how do you win loneliness? Get out of there and like get organized. The role of capitalism in this, it's a question that comes up at every talk, I think, on any topic. And I don't know exactly what is meant by capitalism, to be honest. It's like, do I think people would be less angry if the Soviet Union had persisted? And I think people in the Soviet Union had other problems. And so what is the other from capitalism that is being invited by that question? I am not sure I know. But if what you're saying is a society based on material profit and values, does that contribute to individualization? Of course. Of course we're in a society where everyone wants to get richer. I'll be honest, me included. And I don't think there's, I don't know what the other to that would be to talk about how we exit capitalism. If there's a bit more social, if there's a bit more state intervention, if there's a bit more partisan action, does that mean we're exiting capitalism? It seems to me no. We are in a society where the state intervenes a lot in the economy, and it's not just a capitalist society, it's also, you know, a democratic society in complicated ways. So I'm not sure I know what is the independent variable in that context. But is individualism driven and atomization driven by the profit motive that is at the heart of our societies? I think obviously yes. Can I think of a better option than a profit-driven society? Probably not. I'm just going to be honest there. Okay, conspiracy theories. Conspiracy theories are super interesting because they are very much, I think, the obverse of rage. Conspiracy is a fantasy of agency, it seems to me. People who don't know how to act want to imagine that there is some more coherence than there actually is in the system, and that there's somebody pulling the strings from behind them, and more specifically to undermine them. And look, just because you're paranoid, it doesn't mean they're not following you. So there might be some conspiracies out there. But it seems to me that conspiracy thinking is very much the activity of a lonely person, usually very rational, very educated. If you read Hofstadter's book on the paranoid style in American politics, he has a profile of that really links conspiracy theories to populism, because it is this passive, hyper-intelligent, hyper-rational person that's at home doing their own research and discovering a coherence to the system that's often too simple and isn't really there. But that serves this fantasy of agency, it seems to me. The idea that somebody's actually doing something and running the show, and that if we just hate them, we can resolve the problem. Unfortunately, I think that the causes of our loneliness and the causes of our rage are much deeper than somebody pulling the string in a smoke-filled room. It has to do with the decline of class. It has to do with the decline of religion. It has to do with the decline of organized action in general, and I don't think there's a conspiracy behind that. It's just capitalism. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Carlo.
Invite another round of applause. That was a phenomenal lecture and a phenomenal conversation. And I think it leaves us so much to think about, and I'm happy to share that this has been recorded, not just live streamed, and we'll be sharing it so you can actually have a chance to ponder it and ruminate over it some more. And I want to thank all the students, everyone who asked questions, but particularly our students who asked really intelligent, smart, thoughtful, and engaging questions. Before we conclude, it is an honor for us to have the Feingold family with us today, and I have the privilege of inviting Karen Feingold, Stanley Feingold's daughter, to join us just for a moment to share some reflections on her dad and on this event.
Thank you, Carlos. I think my father would love the idea that rage was the gateway for social change. I think he would have enjoyed talking to you about it. A few days before Stanley died, my brothers and I lied to him. It was fall of 2017, and we collectively decided to tell him that Trump had been impeached. Respectable children would have stopped there, but we pushed it and told him he was resigning. I thought we could have pushed it a little bit further, but I was vetoed. We weren't sure if he understood what we whispered to him, but we thought it was an act of kindness to let him leave this world optimistic about America's future. Last Tuesday evening, my 4 children, now adults, called me, just as I immediately would have called my father. I tried to be measured in my responses. I tried to think of what Stanley would say. Would he be saying democracy is dead, or let's move to Europe, or late-stage capitalism cannot coexist with democracy? I don't think so. I think after a stiff cocktail, he would be at his computer, writing, trying to unwind and untangle what went wrong. His questions, and perhaps some answers, would not be found in blaming the voters, no matter who they voted for, but by searching our society and where our political system has failed those it claimed to protect. He would have found Trump to be the cough to a much larger cold, and it's the cold that would have interested him. He was a hardcore atheist, and deities, self-proclaimed or otherwise, did not hold his interest. Stanley lived through world wars, the Depression, the loss of family from illnesses born from poverty, polio of the brain, McCarthyism, and much more. The next 4 years would have been part of this list, and he, as well as us, will overcome it. He was a believer in humankind and kindness, and he believed the youth would right the course of the mistakes of previous generations. He would be looking towards the students to lead us to a better tomorrow. Seeing this gathering today of his former students and present students studying at CCNY would have filled him with great hope. To all his students, thank you for the extreme joy that you gave him and your work to honor him in this lecture series. Thank you, Dean Rich, for your continued support. Most of all, thank you to all the professors and students who are actively doing the work to educate and enlighten us. Thank you.
Karen, thank you very much, and thank you for allowing us to have this annual tradition to honor your dad. Thank you all very much for being here. Carlo, thank you. Amina, thank you so much. Thank you to all the alums of the Feingold era, and we wish great success to all of our current students in going out and finding yourself your Stanley Feingold. Good afternoon.